Most of us remember the P-51 Mustang as the Cadillac of the skies, the war hero that saved our bombers and broke the back of the Luftwaffe. But in 1942, the Mustang wasn't a hero, it was a heartbreak. It was a world-class airframe powered by an engine that literally choked to death at the very altitude where our boys were dying. The truth is, the original Mustang had the legs to fly to Berlin, but it didn't have the lungs to fight once it got there. It was a Ferrari with a tugboat heart, a flying coffin trapped in a low-altitude roll while the real war was being decided 5 miles above the Earth. Today, we're diving into the secret history of the Hucknall test flights where British grease and American aluminum collided to solve the infinite ceiling. We're looking at the desperate cross-continental gamble that turned a doomed plane into the deadliest fighter of World War II. Because without this one mechanical marriage, the invasion of Europe might never have happened. If you grew up watching the old newsreels, you probably remember the P-51 Mustang as the Cadillac of the skies. It's a silhouette that defines an era, sleek, silver, and seemingly invincible. But there is a chapter of this story that often gets skipped in the history books, a time when the Mustang wasn't a hero, but a heartbreak. Before it was the savior of the skies, the early iterations of this bird were whispered about by pilots as something far more grim, a flying coffin at high altitude. We have to understand the stakes of 1942. The 8th Air Force was bleeding. Our boys were flying B-17s into the heart of Germany, and they were doing it alone. The unlimited range of the bomber was a myth that was costing thousands of lives, because once those bombers crossed the coast of France, their fighter escorts had to turn back. They simply didn't have the lungs for the journey. You might wonder, why didn't we just send the Mustang? The reality is that the original P-51, equipped with the American-made Allison V1710 engine, was a masterpiece of design below 15,000 feet. It was fast, it was nimble, and it looked the part. However, as soon as a pilot tried to climb to the thin air where the B-17s lived, that Allison engine would gasp for breath. It lacked a 2-stage supercharger. In the high-altitude arena where the war was actually being decided, the Mustang was essentially a paperweight. It couldn't protect the bombers because it couldn't even reach them with enough power to fight the Luftwaffe's Bf-109s. Imagine the frustration of a young pilot sitting in the cockpit of the most aerodynamic airframe in the world, yet feeling the engine choke and sputter just when the Messerschmitts began their dive. It was a tragic mismatch of a world-class body and a middle-class heart. This gap in performance wasn't just a technical footnote, it was a crisis that threatened the entire strategic bombing campaign. The Mustang was a beautiful failure, a plane with the potential to win the war, yet sidelined by a ceiling it couldn't break. But, as we're about to see, the solution didn't come from a drawing board in California, it came from a chance encounter in a British hangar that would change the course of human history. By 1942, the air war over Europe had reached a stalemate that was costing the Allies their best men. While the American Allison engine was struggling to find its breath, the British were fighting a different kind of battle. They had the Rolls-Royce Merlin, an engine that had already saved their skin during the Battle of Britain. It was the heart of the Spitfire and the Hurricane, but the British knew that even the legendary Spitfire lacked the fuel capacity to follow bombers deep into Germany. They had a world-class engine, but they didn't have an airframe that could carry it across the continent and back. This set the stage for a meeting at a quiet airfield called Hucknall. Ronald Harker, a test pilot for Rolls-Royce, affectionately known as Ronnie, took a flight in one of the new American P-51s. He was an experienced hand, a man who knew exactly how a fighter should feel. When he landed, he didn't just give a standard report. He told his superiors that the American plane was the finest Escort airframe he had ever flown, but it was being strangled by its power plant. He made a radical suggestion. What if we took the Merlin 61, the engine with the 2-stage supercharger, and dropped it into the Mustang? It sounds like a simple fix in hindsight, but at the time, this was a massive industrial gamble. The Mustang was designed by Americans in California. The Merlin was a masterpiece of British craftsmanship in Derby. They used different bolt standards, different cooling requirements, and entirely different philosophies of maintenance. Many of the top brass were skeptical. Why take a perfectly good British engine and waste it on an American plane that was already labeled a low-altitude specialist? The urgency, however, was fueled by the sight of B-17s falling out of the sky over places like Schweinfurt. The British and Americans couldn't afford pride. They needed a miracle. At Hucknall, engineers began the delicate surgery of fitting a square peg into a round hole. They had to redesign the nose of the aircraft, move the air intakes, and account for the massive increase in heat that the two-stage Merlin would produce. It wasn't just about making it fit, it was about making sure the plane didn't shake itself apart from the raw power. While the mechanics worked in the grease and cold of the hangars, the pilots waited. They knew that if this marriage failed, the daylight bombing campaign might have to be abandoned entirely. That would mean the invasion of Europe, the D-Day they all knew was coming, might never happen. The pressure on the Hucknall team was immense. They weren't just building a prototype, they were trying to save a strategy. The success at Hucknall was just the beginning. To truly turn the Mustang into a world beater, the engineers had to master a piece of technology that feels like science fiction even today: the two-stage, two-speed supercharger. If the Allison engine was a runner breathing through a straw, the Merlin 61 was a runner with an oxygen tank strapped to its back and a computer-controlled lung. To understand why this changed everything, we have to look at the physics of the infinite ceiling. As a pilot climbs, the air doesn't just get thinner, it gets colder and less predictable. Most engines of the era used a single-stage supercharger, essentially a fan that spun to shove air into the cylinders. But at 25,000 feet, a single fan couldn't spin fast enough to compress that ghost air into something the engine could actually burn. If you spun the fan faster, the air would get so hot from the friction of compression that it would cause the engine to knock or detonate, blowing the cylinders apart. The Merlin's two-stage solution was a masterpiece of mechanical layering. Instead of one fan, it used two. The first fan would compress the thin, freezing outside air and pass it to a second fan, which would compress it even further. This created immense heat, often over 200 degrees Celsius. To keep the engine from melting, the engineers added an intercooler or aftercooler between the supercharger and the engine. This was a separate radiator circuit that chilled the air back down, making it dense and oxygen-rich before it hit the pistons. For a pilot, this meant that for the first time, he had a shift gear for the sky. The two-speed part of the name refers to the internal transmission for the supercharger. As the Mustang climbed through 14,000 feet, an aneroid switch, much like the barometer in your hallway, would automatically engage a high-ratio gear. You would feel a kick in the back as the supercharger shifted into high gear, maintaining the manifold pressure even as the world outside turned into a vacuum. This engineering feat turned the P-51B and D models into monsters of the high blue. While the German Bf-109s were struggling to stay airborne at 30,000 feet, the Mustang was still accelerating. It gave the American pilots the one thing every fighter pilot craved: the vertical. In a dogfight, altitude is potential energy. If you are higher than your enemy, you own the engagement. You can dive, strike, and zoom back up to safety before they even know you're there. The Merlin didn't just give the Mustang speed, it gave it the high ground. However, adding this much hardware came with a cost. The Merlin is a heavy, thirsty beast. The extra weight of the two-stage blower and the liquid-filled intercooler threatened to ruin the Mustang's greatest gift, its range. Every gallon of coolant and every pound of steel for the supercharger gears was a pound of fuel they couldn't carry. The engineers at North American Aviation had to perform a second miracle. They had to find a way to make this heavy, high-performance machine stay in the air for 8 hours at a time. History suggests that the Mustang's success wasn't just about the engine's power, but about the efficiency of the airframe it lived in. The Mustang featured a laminar flow wing, a design so slick it practically slid through the air with half the drag of a traditional wing. When you paired that low-drag wing with the brute force of the Merlin, you got a plane that could cruise at 400 miles per hour while barely sipping fuel.
It was the perfect synthesis of British power and American aerodynamic genius. Many of us look back at these machines and see cold metal and rivets, but to the men who flew them, the Merlin Mustang was a living thing. It had a specific growl, a deep, resonant thrum that sounded like 1,000 sewing machines running in perfect unison. When a group of Mustangs flew over, the sound didn't just hit your ears, it hit your chest. It was the sound of industrial superiority. The Germans, for their part, were terrified. They had spent years perfecting high-altitude interceptors, only to find that the Americans had suddenly leapfrogged them with a hybrid bastard aircraft. They couldn't outclimb it, and because of the Merlin's efficiency, they couldn't wait for it to run out of gas. The infinite ceiling was no longer a sanctuary for the Luftwaffe, it was a hunting ground for the 8th Air Force. This newfound dominance at altitude solved the how of the fight, but it didn't solve the where. Even with a perfect engine, a fighter is useless if it runs out of fuel over the English Channel. The next hurdle wasn't mechanical, but logistical, turning this high-altitude interceptor into a transcontinental bodyguard.
By late 1943, the Merlin-powered Mustang had the lungs to reach the ceiling of the war, but it still faced a geographical ghost. The Luftwaffe had a simple strategy: wait. They knew the American P-47s and British Spitfires had limited fuel. If the German fighters simply stayed on the ground or hovered deep inland, the Allied escorts would eventually hit their bingo fuel mark and be forced to turn back. The moment those little friends dipped their wings in a goodbye salute, the German interceptors would swarm the bombers like sharks in a feeding frenzy. To solve this, the P-51 had to become a ghost, a fighter that could appear over Berlin, stay for the fight, and still have enough gas to make it back to East Anglia. If you've ever gone on a long road trip in a classic car, you know the anxiety of watching that fuel needle drop when there isn't a station for miles. Now, imagine that feeling while being shot at by a Focke-Wulf 190. The first part of the solution was a triumph of aerodynamics called the laminar flow wing. Most wings of the era were curved in a way that created turbulent air almost immediately, which acted like an invisible parachute pulling the plane back. The Mustang's wing was different. It was designed with its thickest point much further back, allowing the air to slide over the surface in smooth, laminar layers. This design reduced drag so significantly that the Mustang required less throttle and therefore less fuel to maintain high speeds. It was the aeronautical equivalent of a knife cutting through silk. But even the slickest wing couldn't change the laws of physics. You still needed raw gallons of high-octane gasoline to cross the North Sea and the German border. This led to the controversial 85 tank. Engineers realized there was a small, unused void behind the pilot's seat. They decided to cram an 85-gallon self-sealing fuel tank into that space. On paper, it was a stroke of genius. In practice, it turned the plane into a mechanical nightmare for the first hour of flight. With that rear tank full, the Mustang's center of gravity shifted so far back that the plane became dangerously unstable. If a pilot tried to dogfight with a full rear tank, the nose would wander and the plane could enter a flat spin that was nearly impossible to recover from. History suggests that the true bravery of the Mustang pilots wasn't just in the dogfights, but in the discipline required to fly those first 200 miles. They had to sip from that rear tank first, flying straight and level, waiting for the weight to drop before they were cleared for combat. Then came the paper tanks. To push the range even further, the Allies developed 75-gallon and 108-gallon drop tanks made of resin-impregnated paper. They were cheap, they didn't use strategic metals, and they allowed the Mustang to carry its extra fuel on the outside. A Mustang would take off, climb to altitude using the fuel in the drop tanks, and then, just as they crossed into enemy territory, the pilots would pull a lever. Hundreds of empty tanks would rain down on the German countryside, and the Mustangs, now light and nimble, would continue the journey on their internal reserves. For the German High Command, the sight of Mustangs over Berlin was the beginning of the end. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, famously remarked that when he saw Mustangs over the capital, he knew the war was lost. It wasn't just that the Americans were there, it was that they were there with a fighter that could outturn, outclimb, and outlast anything the Reich could produce. The little friends were no longer just a temporary shield, they were a permanent shadow. The bombers finally had a bodyguard that wouldn't leave their side. This shift in logistics didn't just protect the B-17s, it forced the Luftwaffe to come up and fight. By staying in the air longer, the Mustangs systematically dismantled the German Air Force through attrition. The Mustang had evolved from a short-range scout into a long-range executioner. It was a feat of engineering that combined the slickness of the American wing, the roar of the British engine, and the sheer audacity of an 85-gallon gamble. The war was won in the details of those fuel lines and wing curves. But as the smoke cleared in 1945, the Mustang's story didn't end. It left behind a legacy that changed how we think about the relationship between a pilot and his machine. The war eventually moved from the skies to the history books, but the P-51 Mustang never truly faded away. Most aircraft from that era are remembered as relics, museum pieces that smell of oil and old canvas. But the Mustang is different. It remains the gold standard of piston-driven flight, and a large part of that staying power comes down to the whisper of its laminar wing. If you've ever stood on the tarmac at an air show when a P-51 performs a high-speed pass, you've heard it, a distinct, high-pitched whistle. That sound isn't the engine, it's the air itself screaming as it's forced through the gun ports and over those incredibly smooth wing surfaces. It is the sound of a design that was decades ahead of its time. The laminar flow wing, once a desperate experiment to save fuel, became the blueprint for the jet age. History suggests that the Mustang's true legacy wasn't just the battles it won, but the industrial philosophy it proved. It showed that the best solutions don't always come from a single mind or a single nation. It took the daring of American airframe designers and the refined power of British engine builders to create a machine that was greater than the sum of its parts. This marriage of necessity set the stage for the NATO alliances we know today, a realization that shared technology is the ultimate deterrent. Many of us who grew up in the shadow of that conflict see the Mustang as a symbol of a time when the world was black and white and the stakes were absolute. But the Mustang whispers a more complex story. It tells us that excellence is often found in the gap, the space between a problem and a solution, between a failing engine and a perfect wing. Today, when a Mustang takes to the sky, it isn't just a flight, it's a mechanical prayer. It reminds us of the young men who trusted their lives to a two-stage supercharger and a paper fuel tank. It reminds us that engineering isn't just about metal. It's about the spirit of the men who refuse to accept a ceiling. The Mustang still whispers because the problems it solved, the need for range, the need for power, and the need for a little friend in the dark, are lessons that never go out of style. The story of the Mustang is more than just a history lesson. It's a testament to what we can achieve when we stop worrying about who gets the credit and start focusing on the mission. If you've spent your life around engines, or if you remember the sound of these birds in your youth, your perspective is a vital part of this story. I'd be honored if you'd join our community by subscribing to the channel. We're dedicated to keeping these technical histories alive for the next generation. Leave a comment below and let us know, do you believe the Mustang would have achieved its legendary status without the British Merlin, or was the airframe always the true hero? Your insights often provide more value than the script itself. And if you have a friend or a fellow veteran who appreciates the old-school way of doing things, please share this video with them. It helps us more than you know. Thank you for your time today and for helping us keep the greatest generation's engineering legacy from fading into the clouds.
Most of us remember the P-51 Mustang as the Cadillac of the skies, the war hero that saved our bombers and broke the back of the Luftwaffe. But in 1942, the Mustang wasn't a hero, it was a heartbreak. It was a world-class airframe powered by an engine that literally choked to death at the very altitude where our boys were dying. The truth is, the original Mustang had the legs to fly to Berlin, but it didn't have the lungs to fight once it got there. It was a Ferrari with a tugboat heart, a flying coffin trapped in a low-altitude roll while the real war was being decided 5 miles above the Earth. Today, we're diving into the secret history of the Hucknall test flights, where British grease and American aluminum collided to solve the infinite ceiling. We're looking at the desperate cross-continental gamble that turned a doomed plane into the deadliest fighter of World War II. Because without this one mechanical marriage, the invasion of Europe might never have happened.